The first page is an overview of the different styles of music we're going to talk about in this class, along with my bibliography. And the rest of the packet is the pieces that we're going to listen to with some of my notes on what we're going to talk about in each piece, and a translation for those of them that I was able to translate. Did you get a handout? Okay, great. This class, as you know, is going to be a basic overview of music in Western Europe from about 1300 to 1400, so its scope is really limited. It's mainly about the music of rich, white, educated men, because unfortunately hardly anybody else's music was saved. Although we're going to touch on one major exception to that when we get to Geisslerlieder later on. This class is also going to focus on composers and composition rather than performers and performance, also partly because we have that information. This actually ties in really well with the two classes that were this morning. But more than anything else, what I want to focus on with the 14th century is rhythm. So the big thing in this century in Western art music is about this invention of a new form of rhythmic notation by Petrus de Cruz, as we talked about in the previous class. What followed his new style of notating rhythm was a flowering of rhythmic complexity as composers started experimenting with what this new tool allowed them to do. And so we're going to look at how this new ability to notate rhythm really changed what people could do with music. So how many of you were at the 13th century class? Most of the class, but not everyone. Okay. You were there. I was there. So, as we talked about, when you're looking at troubadour pieces or Minnesänger pieces, they don't notate rhythm. They didn't really have a way of notating rhythm. Sometimes in the later pieces you have a rather clunky system. We talked about the rhythmic mode system, where it's very formulaic. There's only so many rhythms that you're allowed to use, and it's just messy on the page, and you don't. You really have to think about it. You can't just sight read it very well. But in this new rhythmic notation system, details. I'm not going to be able to give you all the details because I only have an hour here. But what it could do is basically the shape of the note determines its length. So once you know what the note shape is, you know how long the note is, no matter what. It had a concept of measures, like we think about them. Not exactly the same as we think about them, but similar. So there's patterns of rhythms in 2 or 3 beats, which would be divided into subdivisions of 2 or 3. Here are handouts for those who don't have them yet. Philippe de Vitry, who was a later theorist, added a subdivision. So now you can have what are essentially 8th notes, 16th notes to us. And now you don't have to stick to the limited number of patterns that were available when using the rhythmic modes. You can invent your own new patterns, or you cannot have any repetition of patterns at all if you don't want to. So this allowed a ton of freedom for composers. We're going to start by talking about Ars Nova, which was a movement in France in the early and mid 14th century. Some characteristics of Ars Nova are that it is, for the first time really, in this area and in this context, secular music gains a sophistication that was formerly reserved only for sacred music. So this is secular music. It's by nobles. It's by very, very educated people. They are really interested in poetry, much like the troubadours. So their musical forms are being dictated by the forms of the poem. And there's an emphasis on linear rather than vertical. So what I mean by that is the melody, more important than harmony. The rhythm of the line is more important. I think you're making a confused face.
No, I'm making harmony. There wasn't any harmony. What are you talking about?
Well, exactly. Exactly. Right. So we're thinking of things.
Harmony in the modern sense did not exist.
Exactly. So we're thinking about things, and when you're listening to these pieces, don't be listening for chords. Be listening for melodies, for things that happen over a period of time rather than at the same time. Another thing they started to do this time period, which was do complete settings of mass ordinaries. And I know I said that sacred was less important than secular to them, but what they would do is they'd be, they were really making these into forms of art that went together. So all the pieces in this one mass would go together, and a lot of times they would use secular music as a basis for this mass piece. The first piece that I want to play for you is called L'Enfant et son commencement, and my French is really bad, so I'm sorry. It's a rondo.
All the pronunciation
Just say it really
changes.
fast.
Well, it depends on the time period, right?
That's true.
Yes, it does.
Changes, so.
It is a rondo, which is one of the form fiques. Who knows what form fiques is? About half the class. Okay. So the form fiques are there are three basic poetic forms that were just used constantly throughout the medieval period. And these poems would be, each one of them has a specific number of lines, a specific rhyme pattern. A lot of times they would have a specific number of syllables per line, although that changed throughout period. But poems and poems and poems and poems would be written in these forms. And then when they would set these poems to music, they would take music that matched. So when there's a line that ends in, all the lines that end in the same rhyme would have the same tune. Or all of the sections that went together with a poem that were the same form would have the same music to go with them. That actually works very well. What?
They didn't do that.
They did not do that in the 13th century. So when you look at troubadour poems, for example, they are also in that form, a lot of them, but their music doesn't follow that. So here we're really seeing not just words and music, but words dictating what the music does. You can see on the handout here that,
Written the form down, which is helpful.
yes,
I like to think of this form as like a, what do you call them, chant, or pom-poms, you know? A, B, A, B, because of the capital versus syllables.
if you look at the bottom of the page here where they have the lyrics written, I have written A, B, A, B, A, B. This is on the first page of the handout. Do you have the handout?
No.
Is there a spare handout somewhere?
Yes.
Yay, wonderful. Okay.
Thank you.
All of the capital A's are exactly the same line. The lowercase a are lines that rhyme with that. All the capital B's are exactly the same line, and the lowercase b's are lines that rhyme with that. This is the form of a rondo. A, B, A, B, A, B. And you can see that he did that with the tune. So you have your A line. This first half of the piece is A's. The second half of the piece is B's. So all of the B lines have this tune, and all of the A lines have this tune. And that's why when you look at it, you're like, wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
Yeah.
because it's going A and B. This piece is also especially cool because he does even more cool things with the words dictating the music. So if you look at what the words mean, they say, my end is my beginning, and my beginning is my end, which is what a
So we
rondo
should
is.
just read it like,
So,
oh, yeah.
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 And he says, my third time is retrograde.
Says that in the words.
Yep,
Yep.
it says that in the words. So if you look at where I've written in blue,
So retrograde.
the melody in the top voice for the A part is exactly backwards of the melody for the second voice in the B part. So we totally took it and just retrograded it. It's really cool and kind of artsy. So I'm gonna play it. Yeah. I just got an email, I'm sorry. Put my slow on. back to line 3. That's not the whole piece, but I'm not going to play the whole piece today. The second one that I want to play for you is another Ars Nova piece, which is actually on the next page, is a motet, which means that it's a piece that's based on what they call a cantus firmus, which is a melody, at this time usually taken from plainsong chant, that they used as the basis of this polyphonic composition called the motet. And the other lines are set against this cantus firmus in counterpoint, not necessarily having anything to do with each other, but they both sound good with the cantus firmus. At this time, a motet is a composition where the tenor line, that cantus firmus, moves pretty slowly, and the higher voices move at a faster rate. They're often written in totally different languages. Sometimes you'll get as many as 3 or 4 different languages in the same motet. Sometimes these texts have nothing to do with each other, but in this motet in particular, they do. This is if you get a chance to look at the translation, I know it's really tiny on there, but it is actually a political piece about the state of the French government at the time and the influence that a particular advisor that the composer did not like had over the king.
You would never know that.
It's totally in code, right?
Yeah.
It's about a lion who is being influenced by an evil dragon, right?
You say so.
Right?
I can't even follow that. But wow.
And it also helps that it's about a cock, but the word for rooster in French is the same, is very similar to the word for Frenchman. So that's your clue.
Yeah.
This piece uses a technique called isorhythm, which is really cool, also really artsy and really different, something that you can do with rhythm that you could not do before. Isorhythm uses a repeated rhythmic pattern and a repeated melodic pattern as its main structure for the piece. Hello. Do we have another handout? Awesome. We are on Gardes Gaius, which is the 3rd page. So in isorhythm, you'll have like a pattern of maybe 17 rhythmic notes, like half note, quarter note, half note. There will be 17. And you'll have maybe 11 pitches that you're just going to use. And you repeat those over and over and over again until and then the piece ends when they line back up.
That's like 20th century.
Yes, it is.
Crap.
Yes, it's very
That's pretty scary.
it is not something you would hear being sung by a folk singer on the street. It is very like something you can only appreciate if you're looking at the score and you know to look for it. They were really into numerology. You'll get some pieces where they're picking like sacred numbers, for sacred music, and it's pretty cool. At this piece, I've marked, I don't know if the colors are really that different, but where these are circled is A in measure 1, and then the B down here at the bottom of the page, those are the color, which is the, oh gosh, I can never remember which one it is. Oh, it's the pitches. Color is the name for the pitch pattern. And the telea is the name for the rhythmic pattern. And I've circled every time the telea marks in blue. So you'll see at the bottom of the page down here is the second text for the telea. There's a third one here. There's a fourth one that starts when the second color starts. Does everybody see how that works?
Got it.
Okay, I'm going to play the piece. so as you can hear, a lot going on in this piece. A lot of times when people perform motets now, they'll sing one line at a time and then put all three together so that you get a chance to hear all three. But like I said, we don't really know if that's how they did it in period or if they just performed it like this. I mean, it could be that just like how isorhythm is something that you can only appreciate if you look at the score, that the words are also something that you can really only appreciate if you already know what's going on. It's a totally different way of thinking about music. I'm getting a lot of looks like.
I mean, I wondered like if it might be kind of like when I was a teenager and played rock music and my parents were like, "What are the words? How can you understand the words?" And I could understand the words, like
because you're used to listening to it.
Maybe they were just used to listening to it, and they
Because you read the back of the album.
I mean, it could be
Oh,
both.
here's my other question. Is this meant for people to get together and just sing for their own enjoyment, or is this to be performed?
That's a really good question.
Because if you're just doing it for your own enjoyment, you don't need to go through all that.
You're right. I don't know that there is I don't know a whole lot about when this would have been performed, like if it was at concerts or in court, or I mean, it's court
I mean,
music.
they didn't have concerts in the modern
Right, in the modern
sense.
sense.
But they had musical entertainment.
Right. But this is clearly for very, very educated, sophisticated musicians. What were you about to say, Kasha?
Well, I've seen motets where one line or another is a standard piece.
Mhm.
So you just, if it were, a tune that everybody knows, then you don't have to worry about the sensibilities of people understanding that. It's just, you're playing this new piece and the tenor line is, an old familiar, like.
Right, so maybe it's just not even
Oh,
important.
Susanna or something
Yeah.
like that. And so all you need is one of them to be familiar, and you don't need to worry too much about that. But otherwise, I have understood that some sacred motets were being done as interludes during Mass.
Okay. I think that's true. Yeah, sacred ones, right? Yeah. And you will get sacred ones. This one isn't obviously, but
What kind of a juxtaposition is that though? You're in church listening to Mass and you recognize the bass line as being of Susanna.
but it happened. I mean, they would use. I mean, sometimes they use drinking whoring songs too. Like
Yeah.
it was evidently fine. So
That's a tune?
Lombardy
Yeah.
was really popular in the
Yes.
15th century.
what is there, like 50 masses that we know that have Little Marmee as a
Right.
base?
Yeah.
Well, and for that matter, Soon Versus Coming In was taken and sanctified and given proper Easter lyrics.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Well, Martin Luther's line, why should the devil have all the good tunes?
Yeah, most of Martin Luther's drinking songs have had all of them, so.
Yeah. I didn't know that. That's neat.
The Star Spangled Banner is an English drinking song.
That's true. That's true.
Right, and I've heard it
And
performed.
we know that one more than the drinking song.
Yeah.
So that's a long tradition then. It wasn't something that Martin Luther came up with. It's been going on for
Oh, yeah.
centuries before him,
Yeah, I mean,
of secular music being adapted for church.
absolutely.
But did they have to do something sacred with that music? Did they have to get some sort of blessing from the bishop?
Not
Or some
that I
kind
know
of
of.
recognition?
Not that I know of. Although, of course, we're talking about a long time period, so there are different rules at different places and different
I've
times.
also heard that particular specific musical instruments were permitted to be in the church to be used with Mass and some were not, or it had to have a cross written on it or something.
I know that does depend on where you are. Because I know, for example, in Russia, there are no musical instruments allowed in classical. What were you?
Well, I know, especially after the Crusades, they had to talk to the Pope, the different people that were in the church, talking about what minor parts of scales were allowed, if they were allowed to have, major sevenths in a minor scale, because that was really a part of the musical culture over in places that they went to the Crusades. So I think that it's pretty plausible that they had to talk to people about it, because they had to talk about it.
You mean they had censors?
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm
pretty
sure they
much.
do.
Absolutely.
Well, and there's always, in every subject, but in music too, there's always two forces working against each other at the time. There's a force for innovation and there's a force for conservation, and they're constantly interacting with each other.
Well, the other big controversy in sacred music is whether you have to sing one syllable per note, or whether you can run around in one syllable, which makes it much harder to follow the text.
There were tons
That was a
of
huge controversy.
rules made later, like codifying
Later
them.
on.
When was that controversy exactly?
Reformation and
So it was
Counter
Reformation that
Reformations.
introduced that. I've read that John Calvin actually wrote
Well,
rules
no,
in
we've been
Geneva.
arguing about that some earlier, a couple hundred years earlier.
So it was, all right. Again, that was
Well,
not.
Probably a
music,
recurring
when
issue.
music with a lot of notes.
Well, we're
came
gonna
in,
move on
it was-
to
it was kind of-
what was going on in Italy,
Okay.
because I'm worried about getting through all of my class,
So,
so.
France
So that's
So,
earlier.
so that was France. We're going to move on to Italy, where something similar is happening, but not quite the same thing. Actually, it's so similar that some scholars will say this is just Italian Ars Nova, it's not its own thing. But it does have some unique characteristics of its own. We call it the music of the Trecento, which is just short for 13th century. In Trecento style, it has an importance of melody that is even heightened over Ars Nova. They had what they called cantilena style, which is a florid top voice that would be supported by one or two voices below them that are more regular and slow moving. So as we listen to these pieces, you'll hear like a really fancy line and then something a little less complicated on the bottom. Unlike in motets, in Italy, the voices sang all the same words at the same time, which made it much easier to understand. And they could do things, because of that, they could do interesting things that you couldn't do in France with program music. So they could do things like having voices imitate each other when they're talking about chasing, or do some other kinds of text painting. They had a lot of onomatopoeic songs where they would like make dog noises or whatever. One of the ones we're going to listen to is like that. And they really started moving toward what we think of as a more familiar to us form of tonality. So you start to hear an increased use of triads and passing tones that they're putting in to avoid making the lines sound parallel to each other. To get this more, I think compared to personally, my opinion is that it's a little bit more like light and elegant than the French music. So we're going to listen to the first one, which is Fenice Fu. It is called a madrigal, which is not the same form as a madrigal that we think of in Renaissance music. In the Trecento, Italy, a madrigal is a piece with a 3-line verse and a 2-line chorus. It's usually 2 voices, and that's a madrigal, and it was a very common form in this time period. The voices in this piece, you'll hear them singing some words together, so it's pretty easy to understand. It has these long, melodic, florid passages, and you'll see that there are some really decorative rhythmic patterns that they wouldn't have been able to do before they had this rhythmic notation. Oh, I can actually. But it helps if I hit only once. The next Italian piece that I want to play for you is really cool onomatopoeia program music, which means it tells a story in the music as well as in the words. It's called Posto che l'alba. It is in Kasha form, and a Kasha was an Italian piece. Yes, it means chase. So it's two voices that are singing the same thing, one after each other, not at the same time, like a round. But it goes the whole piece. They very often had onomatopoeias. So in this piece, you're going to hear men calling for their dogs. You're going to hear them screaming at each other. You're going to hear hunting horns. And I've tried to mark a lot of them in the music here. Here we go. Yes.
It's the first time I followed, I know that song, I performed it, but never had the English word.
Oh, good.
And
Yeah.
the idea that that was actually what it was saying.
And you could hear, like, you would definitely hear that horn call.
Yes.
For sure. But I love the part where he's just like yelling, like, it's coming to you, where like, that's a fun piece.
Well, that's a wonderful pun because it's a Kasha, which means a chase.
Oh, and they are
it's
talking
singing
about a chase.
A chase.
I love it. That's I'm saving that. That's good.
And it's sort of
Moving on
it's a
to,
conversation, two different songs.
yeah,
Not only is it, the rhythm is synchronized, the words aren't synchronized either.
that's true.
Which is, I thought was kind of interesting, but they're not singing the same thing in different places.
No, it's really, it's not like what we see later in Renaissance polyphony. It's like a long round. That's what it is. We are going to talk about something unusual that happened during this time period in Germany next. Go right ahead. What was going on in the time socially was the plague was happening. A lot of people were dying. People were terrified that the last judgment was coming, like the world was going to end, and God was killing all of us. So there was this group of people called they call Geisslerlieder, which means like flagellant. Flagellant is leader of songs. These are flagellants who they would walk and beat themselves while singing and praying to God that, you know, if they would punish themselves bad enough, that God would not punish them even worse. The first movement was in the 1260s, but then it died away, and it just started exploding in popularity in the year 1349. All across Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, reached as far as Britain and Scandinavia. And it was so noteworthy to the people of the time. They just had huge numbers of people involved in this movement that people wrote things down. There was actually one of the first ethnomusicologists that we know of named Hugo Speckstaert von Reutlingen. He was a Swabian priest, and he thought this movement was worth preserving. So he wrote down a few of the songs. They're very simple, and they can give us a good idea of what folk music at the time might have sounded like. People who were not doing Ars Nova or Trecento.
Okay.
People, it's the closest thing that we have to what lots of people might have been singing. Pop music, I guess.
Wow.
And these were all men, but they were not clerics. They were.
These were men and women, children,
Right.
just people leaving their jobs and just like terrified
Oh, sure.
and just going on pilgrimage and beating themselves. I mean, really violently, actually. Some of the descriptions, there's a lot of blood, there's a lot of...
Actually, the idea of people with open sores moving from community to community is one of the things that helps spread plague. Anyway.
That's a good point.
Yes.
Although
He obviously didn't agree with them, or else he wouldn't have bothered writing down anything.
Yeah, I mean, if he did, he would have been with them, I guess. And
Well,
not-
he wouldn't have written down things for future generations because there wouldn't have been any.
That's a good point. He clearly, you're right, he clearly did not think that the world was ending imminently, but he thought it was really interesting what was going on.
He didn't just write down the music, he actually wrote down, he had basically a diary that
Really?
he kept, and he collected stories and stuff.
Neat. I'll have to look into
Yeah.
that more.
Huh.
Musical characteristics of these pieces.
the flagellants were appealing to God, punishing themselves so that their punishment might be lifted.
Yes,
So
that was the
it was an act of hope.
Yes,
desperate
yeah,
hope.
actually,
They were
that's
trying
what I do.
to avoid the end of the world.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. When you look at these pieces, here's what we can see about them that we can maybe use to guess about what other pieces were like. They sound like early German pilgrim songs. So if you look at Walter von der Vogelweide, they kind of sound like his music.
Oh, okay.
They have a vernacular text. They're monophonic, and we are pretty sure they were sung in unison, or with some basic, everyone's singing the same line, but some people decorated differently, that kind of thing. They have very simple forms, usually like a verse and chorus form, or a call and response form. A lot of them actually have this response called, it's Kyrie eleis, is what they say, like, have mercy, and a lot of them just have, like, the leader will sing a line, and then everybody will say Kyrie eleis at the end of every line. I was not able to find a whole lot of examples, but here's one that I could find, and of course there are no recordings, because it's kind of obscure, but it was a big deal in 1349. I'm going to play the Tude of Nu is die Bitvaart zo Heerlijk. What I thought was really noticeable about this tune is the repeated pitch patterns, which I've marked with squares. So simple, small range, anybody can sing it.
Yeah. Now help us the Savior is the last line.
Thank you. I wasn't able to find a translation of it.
I can
It's
understand
actually
some-
standard German.
Is it really?
It's fairly close to standard German.
What's best part?
I don't know what that part is. Now
How
is
far just to go?
so maybe the beggar's journey. Bettler is beggar.
Yeah,
Now is the beggar's journey here?
Yeah, something like that.
Christ, Christ is Christ.
I'm sure
Silver
Jerusalem
is
is
self, Jerusalem. Erfurt and Kreuz would be, he goes on.
He's going to the cross,
Yeah. To his,
to his
I don't know what hunt.
probably death.
Probably.
So exactly what you would expect of a
Yeah.
Pilgrim song.
Yeah.
But it's music created in a desperate moment, so how do we know that it reflects the other kind of music that was also available at the same time?
We don't know.
Yeah.
We're guessing. We're guessing.
But it is similar to music written down from composers from at the same time.
Okay.
Finally, toward the end of the century, in France and in both France and Italy, and also in Spain, there developed this style that we now call the ars subtilior, and it is the culmination of what can we do with rhythm. It really is.
How hard can we go?
Exactly. Other later musicologists have described it as manneristic. So basically, it's art for the sake of art. It requires this intellectual sophistication that just kind of the point of it is that everyone doesn't get it. It's kind of a like this is for me and the cool people. It's very florid. It has a kind of anti-naturalism to it. It's extremely, it's very difficult to perform. It's almost exclusively secular. It's not meant for church, it's meant for the club of cool kids. And it has an extremely unusual amount of rhythmic complexity. A lot of syncopation, a lot of offset mensural things, like one line will be in a totally different time signature than another line. They liked isorhythm, so there's a lot of isorhythm that you'll see. The first piece that I'm going to play for you is actually, you can see the original score. I included it for you because it's so beautiful. Here's another example of, it's called eye music, where you have music that has characteristics that you can only look at, you can't hear. So again, just for the people who get to see the score, it is actually written in the shape of a harp. There are other ones, there's one in the shape of a harp, there's one in the shape of like wheels. It's very artsy. I keep using that word, but that's really the best word for it. It's all about art for the sake of art.
It's like the Victorian fad of writing poems, like a Valentine's poem in the shape of a heart, or
Yeah.
a Christmas carol in the shape of bells, something
Yes,
like that.
exactly like
I
that.
can't
Actually,
read it, but it looks like there's words in red on the scroll that's winded around the curvy part of art.
and it very well might be. They used red ink
Yes.
to.
But I can't read it, but it looks like letters, but.
The red words may mean something. I don't know what those are. Those might be the lyrics to the song, actually. Well, there's more. Maybe another verse. I don't know. The red notes are actually another way of indicating rhythm. It was in for a while. They would use red notes to change the value of the note slightly so that you could have even more complicated rhythms. Kind of like we would put a dot after a note to change the rhythm of the note. This is a virelai, by which is another one of the four beaks. It is, as you can see, it's eye music, and it has the red note notation. And it is a canon. So, kind of like the Kasha, there's an initial melody, and then there's an imitation of the melody. It's not an exact imitation, but you'll hear something that's obviously the same melody, just slightly different, that comes in after the first one. Virelai form, which is the form. Yes, it's simpler than rondo. It has an A form, A, B, B, A, A. So you repeat A at the end. And I have shown you on the lyrics here that
They would
you
have
have a.
formed from the score.
Yes, you can see the form of the score too. So I have the melody for A, capital A and lowercase a, is on this page, and the melody for B starts right here. So let's play it. your rhythm patterns in green.
Yeah.
It's very precise and very difficult as a modern performer, or I'm sure at the time too, but even as a modern performer, very difficult.
Why do you bother doing it if it's simple?
Exactly. If anybody can do it, what's the point? I mean, it's not just snobbery. I think there's just a real joy in when you know so much about something, you want to make it as complicated, as beautiful as you can. When you want to take it as far as you can take it. And that's really what they were doing here. Now we're going to go back to 3, which is another B one. Can you imagine how difficult it is to sing those triplets against straight eighth notes in the other line? Just completely unintuitive. Oh, sorry. Then it goes back to A. I'm actually going to stop there because I want to get to the next piece, which is our last piece. This is another our subtilior piece. It is very long, so we probably won't listen to the whole thing. It is a rondo, like the first piece that we listened to. So A, etc. You can see it marked in here, A, and then the B part starts here where I've marked music for B at the double bar line.
I gotta ask, do you know what they were smoking?
Actually, I looked that up.
Yeah.
That, yeah, they don't know because tobacco was not there.
Wouldn't have been marijuana.
They're some of the people that I read said that it was probably opium. Other people that I read were like, no, it's just about a guy's name and his name was Smoker. And
No, I don't think so.
It's about smoking. I mean, if you were a tobacco smoker, it seems very, very apropos, except they didn't have tobacco, so.
possibly hashish. We don't know.
Sheesh, yeah, smokies.
Smoke at the time also meant to be grumpy. So like if you're smoking, you're like fuming, kind of like.
Yeah.
So it could be that yeah. So the text, whether it's actually about smoking or not about smoking, or in any case,
It's got smoke in there a lot.
yes, it's a sort of an exercise in intellectual absurdity. So it's just like smoke, smokily. The smoker smokes smokily in smoke.
Yeah, that's smoky.
Smoke. It's a really eccentric little piece, an eccentric big piece, a long piece. It has some really unusual chromatic passages for the time. It's incredibly low range for the voices, especially the lowest voice for the time, very unusual. Which also kind of adds to the room is full of smoke feeling, I think. And it has some harmonic sequences where it'll play like the same, or melodic sequences, sorry, where it'll have the same little melodic chunk that's just played over and over again, but like getting lower and lower and lower and lower and lower. I marked one of them here at the top of the second page in the green box where you can see the sequence of the notes, just each chunk getting lower and lower and lower and lower. So I'm going to play some of this for you, probably not the whole 8 minutes.
Who was Solange?
Solange was a French composer who wrote our subtilior. Really, we don't know much about him other than that, and that's all we know of his name.
His pen name or something?
We think so. We don't know.
Is this like his most famous piece?
It's one of them. Yeah, it's one of them. It's an unusual piece, so it gets used as an example a lot.
Yeah.
Hear that almost dissonance? That's very unusual. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of Geisslerlieder at the end of the Renaissance, but this is way before him. It kind of sounds wandery, but it's really intensely kind of, I don't say crunchy because it's so long, but like dissonant. Yes.
There's lots of them. That's way more than that.
Yes. Way more flats and sharps than usual. Here's the B section. Wasn't that weird? You go from that B flat to write a B natural immediately next? Weird.
Well, this is a modern edition.
Yes. And it goes back to A again.
That's okay.
It's mood music. It doesn't
It is. I think it's very emotional. I mean, to me it is anyway.
I find it faster than the
Well, now you've heard something that you haven't heard before.
It's like Hieronymus Bosch in the art world. This is the music world.
Yeah. Yeah. That was France. Moving on into the 15th century, it feels like composers have really taken this as far as they can go with it, and they're ready to work on something else. Mainly tonality. We start getting lots and lots of thirds and sixths, as hearing actual what we would think of as a tonal chord in music in the next century. They start working on more equality and independence between the parts. So, for example, if you look at some of these pieces, the lowest line, for example, look at the Kasha one, the Italian one. This bottom line, it's totally just boring. When you get into later music, composers start to make more of an effort to make all the parts equal. So that's another thing that they worked on when they were done with rhythm. And a development of an international style. I know that you're not just going to focus on Franco-Flemish composers in her 15th century piece, or 15th century class. That was really when people started doing, there started to be a real difference between what was going on in Italy and France and the Netherlands and England. Are there any questions about anything that we listened to or any of the music?
Do you know what they were doing in Spain?
I know that we had some art subtilior in Spain, but that was at the end of the century. I believe what was going on in Spain was a continuation of that, gosh, I can't remember the word, but the Spanish version of troubadours, sort of,
Just call them
okay.
troopers, I know.
Well, I know there's some kind of word that I read on the internet. Anyway, I think that's what was going on there. I could be wrong. Someone who knows more could say something about that. But
I do know that the Codex Las Huelgas continued until late in the 15th century.
and that was the one that we talked about in the class before this. Was that the one with the nuns at the,
Yes.
the convent?
Oh, in Spain.
And as a plug, in the Guido class, if we get to it, I've got a piece from there.
Okay, awesome.
Because 15th century, we have Hondo and Cena and those guys, but I don't really know what that's like. What's between Canticus de Santa Maria and one of those?
Yeah. Nothing that comes up immediately when you look at overview of Western music.
You know.
So I'm sure they weren't just dead there. Something was happening. But either it was something that was very similar to what was going on in other places, and so people didn't mention it, or it was lost, or it was not as influential as some of the things that were happening elsewhere.
I know that that's when, for like instruments and stuff, that's when Tarantella started becoming a very big piece.
Yes,
That's
we
what's
learned
happening,
at the
isn't it?
last class in the 13th century class, 13th century class that they were starting to write down instrumental music pieces, dance pieces.
Yes.
So I wouldn't be surprised if that continued and like grew and there was more of it being done during the 14th century as well.